Hi Husky friends. Hey, I've got a fun art activity that I'd like to share with you. I've had a lot of fun putting these together and I'm excited to show you what I came up with because I think you're going to enjoy doing one of these activities. So before I show you my examples, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Earth Day. This Wednesday, April 22nd, is Earth Day, and every year on April 22nd, Earth Day is celebrated around the world, and it's a day that's set aside to remind all of us how important it is that we each do our part to take care of the earth and care for our environment. And a lot of times we hear things like reduce, reuse, recycle when we hear things about Earth Day and ways that we can do our part. And so I wanted to talk to you about some recycling materials and how we might use that as a part of this art project. So it was kind of my inspiration was Earth Day, and I want to show you here how we might be able to use some recycled paper to make a really neat spring picture. So the recycled materials that I'm talking about are things like grocery bags, maybe if you have some old newspapers around your house, things like grocery store ads, even coupon booklets or old magazines. Those are all really good sources of recycled paper that you could use for this kind of an activity. So ask and see if you have any of these around that you might be able to use for creating this great spring picture. So I'm going to show you my first example that I made by using a grocery bag. That's my background paper, and I cut out my rectangle for my background, and then I had some old newspaper that I just tore to make a little piece that would represent the ground. I don't think it's a big deal that the ground looks like it's white instead of covered with green grass. I think it's kind of interesting because this is recycled material, so it's going to look a little bit different than it might look in nature or real life. So you can see that I drew 3 flowers on mine. I want you to think about what kind of shapes you might want for your flowers, and I'm going to show you an example of some different ideas that I came up with. So here were some of my practice ideas, and you know when we're in the art room we usually practice our ideas before we go on to our final copy, so I thought this would be helpful for me to get it thinking about the different shapes that I would want to consider before I move on to my final copy. So I had my circle flower here, my wavy line that was kind of interesting. It looks sort of like curvy petals. Down here I made sort of a U shape and added a wavy line on the top. This one reminded me of a tulip, and the other one was just using some curved lines to represent some petals. I also thought it was a good idea to practice making some leaves. So I did a smaller kind of a football shape and then a longer skinny one, which I thought would be interesting if I wanted to have a little bit of variety in my leaves. So that gives you some ideas, but I'm sure you can come up with some other shapes on your own, then that's perfectly fine as well. So on my example here, I used a Sharpie to draw my 3 flowers. You might want to do more than 3. I just chose 3 because I knew I wanted to have a little bit of background space that would show also, and I didn't want to go too big, but I needed to make it big enough that it was easy for me to draw them and cut them and put all this together once I started adding details like stems and leaves and things like that. So I used a Sharpie on mine. That makes it a little bit easier for you to see in the video. But if you have a pencil or a pen or a marker, really any kind of drawing tool will be fine for this. I chose to go ahead and do this one to draw it and keep it on the paper as if I could go back in and color it. So if you have coloring materials, you might have some fun going in and adding some color inside your flowers and stems and leaves, but it's also really kind of cool even just like this. I did want to show you a couple of variations because if you wanted to, you can add a little bit more detail. So if you have a little bit of extra newspaper, you might even want to add, if I can hold this up here, you could add a little circle inside your flowers using the newspaper. Another option would be if you've got even more, could you add that newspaper as the whole flower instead of just the centerpiece? So that could be a really cool way to just draw your shapes on your recycled paper and cut them out and put them on your background paper. So that's one version. I want to show you another version that's using some of the colored paper that I found in the grocery ad and in some of my coupons and magazines. So I used the grocery store for my background again, but I used some magazines, and I actually tore these. You can, for any of these, you can tear the paper or you can use scissors. It's entirely up to you. But I used the colored paper to cut and glue some stems and some leaves, And then I also used the different colored paper to make the actual flower. And one of the things that I thought I wanted to mention was the importance of finding a different color if possible for the center, because that really makes that show up when you've got that contrast of a different color or print paper to make that little detail show up even more. So I thought that was a fun way to add a little bit of color. It's still fine if you have some just white and black paper, even though that might not be what we normally see on the ground. It's kind of interesting with all the printed words on there to make it look like some texture. So that's another way that you can do a little bit of variety using some color. I want to show you a third example, and this is if you want to add even more detail. Now, I changed up my background a little bit, and I used newspaper for my background, and then I used my grocery bag to tear the ground. I also used that grocery bag paper for the stem and the leaves on one of my flowers, so I'm kind of mixing it up a little bit. I still use some of my printed green paper for my leaves and my stems, but it wouldn't even be a big deal if those were a different color than green. It's really like, what do you have on hand? That's what you have to remember when you're working on this, is that we're trying to just reuse some of these papers that we already have on hand that might otherwise get recycled or thrown out. So it's fine if it looks different than my examples. One of the things that I did on my flowers, though, is I added a second and third layer. So I cut a different color paper to add another layer of petals on this flower. Over here, I just made a shape of pink paper, a little square that I turned diagonally, and then I also cut some petals out of the blue paper and glued those on. So by adding a little bit more color and layers, I'm getting a little bit more detail. But what I did very different on this was that I used some caps to some pop bottles for the centers. So that was really different than just using paper. I also even got a little more detail by adding a little bug with some extra paper and adding another layer of grass down at the bottom. I just cut a wavy strip of paper, and then I turned and made some little snips, and by bending the paper back and forth, kind of give it some texture and another layer of detail. So a third way to do it, very different. Each of them are very interesting in their own way, and it's really up to you how much detail you want to add, if you want to keep it super simple, or if you want to add color or not. So there's not a wrong answer. I just want you to have fun experimenting with using these recycled materials. If you decide to do the activity and you'd like to show me what you end up with, you can take a picture, ask if it would be okay to post on the Hutchings Elementary Facebook page, and that would be a great way to see your finished artwork, okay? Good luck, and most importantly, have fun, guys.